The club was alive with music, laughter, and the hum of conversation, but at the edge of the room, something else lingered. Tension. Thick, almost heavy, settling over the crowd without anyone noticing at first. A massive figure moved with purpose, each step deliberate, boots scuffing against the floor. He was all muscle, all presence, a man who believed the room was his territory. His eyes locked on one person, Stephen. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He was confident, maybe overconfident, that this night would end the way he wanted, with him towering over someone smaller, weaker. Stephen stood there calm, unshaken, unfazed, his posture relaxed, shoulders easy, hands at his sides, but his gaze was sharp, alert, taking in the room, reading it, weighing it. It wasn't fear that held him steady. It was certainty. Quiet certainty that he didn't need to prove anything, that no amount of bravado could shake. Around them, the club continued its rhythm, clinking glasses, a beat of bass, murmurs of conversation, but the energy of the room subtly shifted. People sensed the undercurrent, the silent tension threading through the air. The enforcer, broad and intimidating, closed the distance, a smirk curling on his face. He had done this before. He knew the effect he had on people, how quickly they could shrink, stumble, or step aside. Tonight he thought he would humiliate another, show the room who commanded the space. But Stephen didn't budge. Not a step, not a flinch, not even a twitch of the eye. The calmness was almost unsettling, a quiet defiance that didn't need words. It drew the eye, made the boldest patrons glance sideways, made the whispers around the edges of the room grow softer. Every movement of the enforcer was loud, exaggerated, a statement meant to dominate. But Stephen's stillness, his slow, measured breathing, countered it in a way that made the tension tangible. People were watching, feeling it. Some held their drinks a little tighter, others leaned back in their seats, curious and cautious. The massive man was used to control, but control had a shape now, and it wasn't his. It moved in the room with quiet authority, effortless and undeniable, concentrated in the presence of the calm figure he had chosen to target. The music pulsed, a distant beat against the real rhythm building between them. Eyes followed every step, every slight shift, every subtle gesture. Stephen's calm was not empty. It was weighty, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The enforcer's confidence wavered, just enough for the room to feel it, just enough to sense that this encounter would not be as simple as he expected. And in that silence, that stillness, the stage was set. Every nerve in the club tuned to the tension, radiating from a single quiet man standing his ground. The enforcer stopped a few feet away, the space between them charged like a wire. His grin was wide, sharp, meant to intimidate, and he leaned in slightly, trying to close the distance without touching. Every motion was calculated, a display of strength, of dominance. Stephen didn't step back, didn't shift his weight. His eyes met the enforcer's, steady, unflinching, and there was something in that gaze that made the smirk falter, even if just a little. "You think you belong here?" The enforcer growled, voice low but carrying across the room. He let the words hang, heavy like a challenge. The crowd around them felt it, sensing the subtle war of wills, the collision of presence and calm. Some people stopped talking, some froze mid-step, all drawn into the unspoken tension. Stephen's expression didn't change. His lips remained neutral, his jaw relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, taking in everything. The quiet in his stance was almost louder than the enforcer's voice. The enforcer shifted his weight, a deliberate move meant to make Stephen flinch. He tapped a heavy boot against the floor, slow, deliberate. It was a small gesture, but loaded with intent. The room seemed to lean in with him, waiting for a reaction. But Stephen didn't give one. Not a flinch, not a blink, not even a tightening of his grip on the glass in his hand. His calm made the enforcer hesitate, just slightly, enough for the tension to grow. "You think you're better than me," the enforcer said, his voice rising a notch. The words were meant to provoke, to draw a crack in Stephen's composure, to give him an opening. The enforcer leaned closer, until the air seemed to sizzle between them. The crowd felt it, instinctively stepping back, giving the two men space. Stephen's slow blink, the faint tilt of his head, spoke volumes without a single word. It was quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need noise or force. The enforcer's grin twitched, just a flicker, but it was there. He jabbed a finger, a little too close, as if marking territory. The movement was aggressive, precise, meant to show control. Stephen simply met it with a steady gaze, tilting his chin slightly. A subtle gesture that shifted the energy in the room. The enforcer's confidence wavered, just enough for doubt to creep in, and the crowd could feel it. The calm in Stephen's presence was like gravity, pulling focus, bending the room to notice, to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Every breath, every blink, every subtle shift mattered. The enforcer's heavy presence pressed forward, trying to dominate, but Stephen's stillness was unyielding. The room tightened around them, all eyes drawn to the silent contest, a clash of motion and calm, of aggression met with steady, deliberate control. The air seemed to pause, waiting for the first move, knowing that it would not be ordinary. The enforcer's chest heaved as he sized Stephen up, each breath loud enough to echo in the sudden hush of the room. He shifted from one foot to the other, a subtle shuffle that belied the tension coiled in his muscles. His eyes never left Stephen, trying to read something, anything, that might give him leverage. The crowd around them moved closer and then back, drawn into the silent storm, sensing that every second mattered. Stephen stood like a rock, feet planted evenly, shoulders loose, hands relaxed, yet every inch of him radiated readiness. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a quiet intensity that seemed to ripple outward. The enforcer's grin flickered again, sharper this time, teeth showing in a jagged line. He took a small step forward, just enough to close the gap, testing boundaries. Stephen didn't move. He didn't blink in panic or shift away. The enforcer jabbed a finger toward Stephen's chest, slow, deliberate, meant to provoke a reaction, to force movement. The room seemed to shrink around them, each onlooker holding their breath, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. Stephen's calm, unbroken, was almost unsettling, and it forced the enforcer to pause for just a split second, a hesitation that felt like an eternity. "You think you can just stand there?" The enforcer sneered, voice low and rough, carrying both threat and disbelief. He leaned in slightly, the air between them thick, heavy with anticipation. Every eye in the room followed the motion, the smallest detail magnified, each subtle twitch under scrutiny. Stephen's gaze didn't waver. He tilted his head just slightly, the faintest movement, and the enforcer's smirk faltered, even if just for a moment. The energy shifted imperceptibly, like a tide inching forward, slow but unstoppable. The enforcer flexed his massive arms, a silent challenge. He shifted weight again, tapping his boot in rhythm with a heartbeat only he could hear. The sound echoed, a warning, a signal that he was ready to strike if provoked. The room felt the tension tighten, a coil wound around every person present. Stephen's presence was the opposite, still, controlled, measured. He didn't react with anger or fear, he reacted with precision, subtle gestures that spoke volumes without words. His calm presence was a counterweight to the enforcer's aggression, and it unsettled the man more than any shout could. The enforcer's hand shot forward, a brief, sharp motion meant to push, to intimidate. Stephen didn't flinch, he didn't pull back. His chest rose and fell in an even rhythm, unshaken. That lack of response was louder than any punch, more disarming than any growl. The enforcer's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in irritation, his eyes narrowing. The crowd leaned in as if sensing that every second of this confrontation was crucial. They could feel the shift in energy, the balance teetering, the unspoken question hanging in the air: who would give first? "You're messing with the wrong person," the enforcer growled, voice rough, low, but there was a crack in it now, subtle, almost imperceptible. He took a step closer, flexing, showing muscle, trying to dominate through presence alone. The air between them seemed to vibrate, thick with tension, almost visible in the silence. Stephen's gaze didn't shift, his chin tilted just enough to meet the enforcer's eyes directly. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the quiet, steady pulse of control. The enforcer blinked, just once, and it was enough for the crowd to notice the slightest hesitation in his movements. The enforcer's breathing quickened, louder now, a contrast to Stephen's even, measured rhythm. He jostled slightly, tapping his hand against his thigh, a tiny, controlled display of energy meant to provoke. Stephen's eyes followed every motion, steady, calm, absorbing, waiting. The space between them seemed electric, the tension almost tangible, like a drawn wire ready to snap. Every person watching felt the pressure, the anticipation. Some held their hands to their mouths, others stiffened, their eyes wide. The room itself seemed suspended in the moment, every heartbeat echoing the clash of wills. The enforcer jabbed again, more aggressively this time, his finger brushing against Stephen's chest. The touch was minimal, but meant to mark territory, to force reaction. Stephen simply tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough, and the enforcer's smirk wavered, faltering under the weight of calm that refused to break. A slow, deliberate pause followed. The enforcer's massive frame seemed heavier now, tension coiling in his shoulders, his stance rigid. He breathed in sharply, trying to regain control. But Stephen's unshakable stillness held the moment, stretched it, amplified it. The crowd shifted, leaning forward, sensing the imminent tipping point. Whispers traveled across the room, but no one dared speak directly. The enforcer's hands clenched, fists flexing, but there was a subtle hesitation, a crack in his armor. Stephen's calm gaze never wavered. Each slow blink, each measured breath, pulled the tension tighter, like a magnet drawing the enforcer into a subtle trap of his own impatience. The energy was not explosive yet, but it hummed, charged, building. Every subtle motion mattered. Every glance, every breath, every shift in weight carried weight. The enforcer was powerful, massive, meant to intimidate, but in the face of Stephen's quiet control, the room sensed something extraordinary was unfolding, something that would not follow the usual rules of force and fear. The enforcer's chest rose and fell quickly, his dominance challenged by nothing more than calm presence. He took a step back, almost imperceptibly testing the waters, unsure. Stephen remained unmoving. The crowd noticed, some shifting slightly, leaning in, caught between fear and fascination. The tension stretched, long, thick, almost unbearable, and it became clear that the clash wasn't just physical. It was mental. A battle of wills, patience versus aggression, calm versus force. And in that silent, drawn-out moment, the room realized that what would happen next wasn't certain, but it would be unforgettable. The enforcer's face was red, a mix of heat and frustration, his massive hands twitching at his sides. Every step he took toward Stephen seemed heavier than the last, every muscle in his body screaming to dominate, to assert control. Yet Stephen didn't budge. He didn't tighten his fists or glare in return. Instead, he stood with that same calm certainty, the kind that made the enforcer hesitate, if only for a fraction of a second. That fraction was all Stephen needed. The enforcer jabbed a finger toward Stephen's chest again, louder this time, sharper, trying to force some reaction. The room felt like it held its breath, every eye fixed on the small space between them, every person sensing that this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a test. Stephen tilted his head slightly, just enough to meet the enforcer's glare without flinching. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear. Just steady, measured attention, like a man who had seen this many times before but refused to react unnecessarily. That subtle motion alone shifted something in the enforcer. The enforcer flexed his arms, his massive shoulders tightening, yet his movements now carried a hesitation. It was almost imperceptible, but anyone watching closely could see it. He was used to controlling spaces, forcing others to back down, yet Stephen's calm presence seemed to weigh against him, subtly but undeniably. The enforcer's foot tapped rapidly, a staccato rhythm of impatience and rising tension, but Stephen's breathing remained steady, even and unbroken. That control, the simple act of standing unmoved, started to dominate the energy in the room. Stephen's gaze held the enforcer's for a long moment, unyielding, unhurried. The enforcer's jaw tightened. A deep growl escaped him, but it lacked the certainty it had carried moments before. The room shifted subtly, the crowd leaning forward, sensing the balance beginning to tilt. They could feel the tension changing, the invisible weight of confidence pressing against the enforcer's aggression. Every inch Stephen stood firm, every measured blink, every calm breath, chipped away at the enforcer's dominance. Then Stephen took a single step forward, slow, deliberate, and the enforcer flinched slightly. Not out of fear, he wasn't afraid, but because the calm control that Stephen exuded was unfamiliar, unnerving. The space between them seemed to shrink without any forceful push. Stephen's presence alone reshaped it, making the enforcer pause mid-motion. The room's energy shifted again. Murmurs began to spread, quiet but charged, as people instinctively sensed that the situation was no longer just a showdown of size and muscle. The enforcer tried to speak, his voice louder now, more forceful, trying to reclaim control. "You don't belong here," he spat, a threat and a challenge bundled together. But Stephen didn't respond verbally. He didn't need to. His calm stance, steady gaze, and measured movement spoke louder than any words. That silence pressed on the enforcer, weighing heavier than any punch could. It forced him to reconsider the simple equation he had relied on his entire life: intimidation equals control. Stephen's composure disrupted that logic entirely. The enforcer's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing uneven now. His arms moved, flexing, then dropping, then flexing again. Stephen mirrored none of it. He didn't mirror aggression. He didn't mirror tension. He mirrored calm. Each second stretched, the enforcer growing restless, impatient, and the room noticing, analyzing every twitch, every sharp inhale, every subtle shift. The energy had changed. The enforcer's dominance was no longer automatic. It required effort, and he was beginning to realize that his effort alone would not win. Then came the first real sign of Stephen's control. A slight tilt of his shoulders, just a fraction forward, just enough to occupy the enforcer's space without threatening. The enforcer hesitated, hand mid-air, as if unsure whether to strike or step back. The pause was electric, holding everyone's attention. That calm, minimal movement, almost invisible if you blinked, conveyed more power than any roar or shove could. It was a subtle claim of authority that demanded recognition. The crowd's eyes followed every detail, sensing the invisible shift, the quiet power that radiated from Stephen. The enforcer's aggressive energy began to waver, almost like a storm meeting a solid wall. He tried to push, to provoke, to assert, but Stephen's calm presence absorbed and redirected it. That small, controlled step, that stillness, that even breath, it all accumulated into a quiet dominance. How do you think calm confidence can change the outcome of a confrontation? The question hung in the air as the tension stretched further, the enforcer visibly struggling to reconcile his need to dominate with the reality that Stephen was not just unmoved, he was unshakable. Every movement Stephen made was deliberate but subtle, and every one of them chipped away at the enforcer's aggression, slowly, steadily, inevitably. The first signs of control were now undeniable, a quiet power pressing against raw force, reshaping the room's energy and the trajectory of what was about to unfold. The enforcer's patience snapped. His movements grew sharper, more aggressive, and the tension in the room thickened like smoke. He leaned in, towering over Stephen, trying to make his presence impossible to ignore. Every footstep, every slight shuffle, carried a threat of warning. Yet Stephen didn't flinch. His stance remained calm, steady, and unwavering. The contrast was striking, raw anger versus controlled composure. The difference was palpable, and it began to shift the atmosphere in ways the enforcer hadn't expected. He jabbed a finger close to Stephen's chest, his voice booming now, filled with a mix of authority and frustration. "You don't belong here." The words came out sharp, like a whip meant to sting, to intimidate. But Stephen's reaction was nothing more than a slow blink, a tiny shift of weight, barely perceptible. That slight pause, almost casual, was enough to make the enforcer hesitate. He had anticipated fear, resistance, or even anger, but not this calm, this control that seemed to absorb his aggression. The enforcer stepped closer, trying to assert dominance with sheer size and volume. He moved with precision, testing the boundaries, measuring the reactions, expecting Stephen to step back or show weakness. But Stephen didn't. He matched none of the aggression, mirrored none of the tension. His eyes stayed locked on the enforcer, unwavering, cool, and deliberate. Every inch Stephen held his ground, every subtle movement forced the enforcer to reconsider his own strategy, forcing him to adjust, react, rethink. The crowd could feel the energy shift. Whispers ran through the room, low but electric, as the enforcer's frustration grew. He paced slightly, fists clenching, the veins in his neck standing out as his anger bubbled closer to the surface. Every breath came sharper, faster, but Stephen's breathing remained even. That calm, controlled rhythm contrasted sharply with the enforcer's escalating aggression. The subtle tension was now a battleground of psychology, and the crowd sensed it. The enforcer's dominance was no longer automatic, it was challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. He tried intimidation through posture, puffing up his chest, making himself appear larger, more threatening. He leaned over Stephen, trying to loom, to dominate the space. Stephen responded with nothing more than a slight adjustment of stance, a minimal shift that maintained balance but never aggression. That small action carried weight, more than anyone expected. It silently claimed authority, suggesting without a word that control was not measured by size or anger, but by composure and awareness. The enforcer's movements became more erratic. One moment he lunged slightly forward, then stepped back, his aggression unchecked but uncertain. His voice fluctuated between low threats and sharp shouts, trying to regain control of both the room and Stephen. But Stephen remained still steady, letting the enforcer reveal himself with each uncontrolled motion. The power dynamic was shifting, subtly but undeniably. The enforcer was showing his hand, and Stephen was reading it calmly, without urgency, without fear. The crowd leaned in, sensing the escalation, sensing the energy becoming more dangerous, yet also sensing the invisible shift toward control. Every tense step, every fist flexed, every growl from the enforcer made Stephen's calm more pronounced. The enforcer's frustration mounted, his movements faster, more aggressive, trying to force a reaction, trying to break the quiet power Stephen maintained. Stephen didn't give him that reaction. Instead, he used minimal movement, subtle adjustments, maintaining his center. Each deliberate breath, each slight shift, each controlled stance absorbed the enforcer's aggression and returned none in kind. The room felt the escalation, anger pressing against calm, raw force pressing against measured control. And the enforcer, for the first time, realized that aggression alone might not be enough to dominate this confrontation. Every push, every shove in energy, every loud word from the enforcer only highlighted Stephen's calm. The escalation was real, intense, and visible, but the balance was tipping slowly, subtly. The enforcer's anger had grown, but Stephen's composure remained unshaken, steady, unyielding. That quiet strength, that controlled presence, began to assert itself in the room. Even as the enforcer's frustration reached its peak, the room was holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the two men, the tension so thick it felt like you could slice it with a knife. The enforcer was breathing hard, chest heaving, face red from the strain of trying to assert control. He had thrown everything he had at Stephen's size, intimidation, threats, but none of it had worked. Each attempt to provoke even a flicker of fear had failed. And then, without warning, everything began to shift. Stephen didn't move aggressively. He didn't shout or push back. Instead, he adjusted his stance just slightly, a subtle shift that somehow seemed to command the space around him. His eyes stayed locked on the enforcer, steady, unyielding, and filled with a calm certainty that seemed to radiate outward. The enforcer's aggression, which had seemed unstoppable, suddenly felt misplaced, unnecessary, even foolish. The contrast between them was now undeniable. The enforcer tried one last shove, a deliberate, forceful movement to assert his dominance. But Stephen didn't react with anger or fear. He absorbed the motion almost effortlessly, redirecting it with a small pivot, a tiny adjustment that required minimal effort but spoke volumes. In that moment, the dynamic changed. The energy in the room shifted from tension to astonishment. People could feel the control moving from the enforcer to Stephen, without a single raised voice or aggressive act. Have you ever seen someone take control of a situation without using force? It was happening right there. Stephen's calm wasn't passive, it was active, purposeful. And it was breaking down the enforcer's aggression in real time. Every breath the enforcer took became more labored, more uncertain. The confidence he had relied on, the raw force he had wielded, was now being absorbed and deflected by Stephen's quiet presence. The enforcer took a step back, almost imperceptibly, but enough for the crowd to notice. That single, tiny retreat was a sign that he was reconsidering, that his dominance was slipping. Stephen didn't advance. He didn't need to. His calm, controlled presence was doing the work for him. It was magnetic, drawing attention, commanding respect without a single hostile gesture. The murmurs started quietly at first, then grew louder. People were noticing the shift, sensing the moment where control had silently transferred. The enforcer's fists were still clenched, but there was hesitation in his movements now, uncertainty creeping into every aggressive motion. Stephen's minimal adjustments, his even breathing, and his unwavering gaze had done what force could not. Stephen spoke softly, almost casually, his words cutting through the tension. They were simple, deliberate, and they carried authority without anger. The enforcer paused, confused by the lack of reaction, by the absence of panic or aggression. He realized slowly that his usual tactics were failing. That this confrontation wasn't about strength, it was about presence, poise, and control. The energy in the room had flipped completely. The enforcer's aggression had become ineffective. His intimidation had no hold over Stephen anymore. Each movement Stephen made was measured, controlled, and intentional, subtly guiding the enforcer's actions without a single physical strike. The crowd leaned in, sensing the invisible pull of dominance shifting. Stephen's calm was a force in itself. It was unshakable, deliberate, and it was dismantling the enforcer's anger piece by piece. Every heavy breath, every tense muscle in the enforcer's body now told a story of someone losing control, of someone being met not with fear or resistance, but with absolute composure. The shift wasn't violent, it was psychological, subtle, and complete. Even the smallest gestures mattered. A step forward, a steady blink, a slight tilt of the head. Each tiny movement was enough to redirect the enforcer's aggression, to guide the encounter without a hint of hostility. Stephen had taken control of a situation that could have spiraled into chaos, and he did it with nothing but calm focus and measured presence. The enforcer stopped moving. His chest heaved, eyes darting, searching for a reaction, a crack, anything he could exploit. But there was nothing. Stephen remained steady, serene, unshaken. It was clear now. Control had shifted entirely. The room seemed to exhale, the tension dissolving as Stephen's calm continued to dominate, effortlessly, silently, and completely. The room finally began to settle. The tension that had been so thick moments ago was starting to ease, replaced by a mixture of awe and disbelief. The enforcer's chest was still rising and falling rapidly, but there was a noticeable change in his posture. The weight of his aggression seemed to be lifting, replaced by hesitation and confusion. He looked at Stephen, trying to read him, trying to understand what had just happened, but found nothing, only calm, steady eyes that refused to give in. Stephen didn't move forward or gloat. He stayed where he was, an unshakable presence in the center of the room. His body language was relaxed, almost casual, yet it carried authority. Every inch of him radiated control, and it was impossible not to notice. The enforcer tried to speak, to assert himself verbally, but the words faltered. His usual confidence had been stripped away, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. He realized that no amount of shouting, pushing, or threats could change what had just occurred. The crowd began to murmur, whispers spreading like wildfire. People exchanged looks, some with relief, others with astonishment. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, a confrontation that could have turned violent, diffused entirely without a single punch thrown. Stephen's calm had done what intimidation and brute strength could not. The enforcer was still standing, but he was no longer in control. His presence felt smaller, less imposing, almost tentative. Stephen shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the room, and the movement carried a subtle signal of dominance. It was not loud or aggressive, but it was unmistakable. Every eye in the club followed him, drawn to the quiet authority he projected. Even the enforcer could feel it, a silent command that made it impossible to continue his previous behavior. He was left with a choice, though it didn't feel like one: back down or risk further embarrassment. The enforcer stepped back slowly, almost reluctantly. His shoulders slumped slightly, a silent admission that he had been bested, not by violence, but by presence, by control, by the quiet force of composure. He glanced around, realizing the attention of everyone present was now on him, judging his defeat. The contrast was stark. Where he had tried to dominate with size and force, Stephen had simply remained steady, and that steadiness had won. People started to relax. The tension in the room lifted, replaced by a sense of order restored. Conversations resumed quieter at first, as everyone processed what had happened. Stephen didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. The resolution was already clear. The enforcer, who had once seemed unstoppable, had been neutralized by nothing more than calm, deliberate action. There was a new energy in the room, one of respect and cautious admiration, even for those who had initially been hostile. The enforcer finally moved away, his attempts at intimidation completely dissolved. Stephen's presence remained the focal point, commanding without effort. The subtle power he held was undeniable, leaving an impression that would linger far longer than the confrontation itself. Every detail of his posture, every measured breath, every quiet glance had contributed to a complete shift in dynamics. The room had witnessed the power of calm over chaos, control over aggression. As people began to settle into the normal flow of the club, there was a sense of understanding that this encounter had left an impact beyond the immediate moment. Stephen had taken a potentially explosive situation and resolved it entirely without conflict, leaving both the enforcer and the witnesses with a lesson in the strength of composed presence. The enforcer's exit was quiet, marked by the subtle acknowledgement that his attempt to dominate had failed completely. In the aftermath, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. The people who had been tense, uneasy, or even fearful now carried a different feeling, an awareness of how calm and controlled action could change the outcome in ways force never could. Stephen's quiet authority had redefined the room's dynamic, leaving everyone present with a memory they wouldn't soon forget. The resolution was not dramatic in a noisy sense, but its impact was absolute, leaving a lasting mark on both the enforcer and the witnesses. The energy in the club had shifted completely. What had started as a tense, almost hostile environment was now strangely calm, almost reflective. People moved through the room differently, more aware of the space around them, more conscious of the presence that had quietly commanded attention. Conversations that had been filled with nervous laughter and forced bravado now had a softer tone, as if everyone was processing what had just unfolded. Stephen's impact lingered in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the calm after a storm. The enforcer had disappeared from immediate view, but his presence was still felt. His failed attempt to intimidate had left him noticeably smaller in the eyes of those who had witnessed it. Even without saying a word, he had been reminded of the limits of aggression and the power of composure. People whispered to one another, exchanging glances that carried both disbelief and respect. They were trying to make sense of what had just happened, how a man so large and imposing could be neutralized without a single punch, without any theatrics, purely by calm presence and measured action. Stephen moved slowly through the club, his steps deliberate, his posture steady. He didn't seek attention, but he carried it effortlessly. People parted slightly, giving him room, sensing the quiet authority he radiated. His eyes scanned the crowd, noting reactions, reading the unspoken acknowledgments of respect. Some looked uneasy, still processing the shift in power they had just witnessed. Others seemed inspired, silently recognizing the lesson in control that had played out in front of them. Staff and onlookers who had initially felt tension or fear now found themselves observing differently. They were no longer preoccupied with potential conflict. Instead, they were more alert, more aware of how presence could alter the course of events. The music continued, the lights remained dim, but the mood had subtly changed. There was a collective exhale, a release of anxiety that had built up during the confrontation. People began to relax into their evening, though the memory of what had happened clung to them, lingering in their minds and conversations. The enforcer eventually reappeared, quieter, more subdued. He moved through the crowd without his usual swagger, clearly affected by the encounter. His confidence had been shaken, not broken entirely, but sufficiently to alter his approach. He avoided eye contact with Stephen, understanding on some level that the dynamics had changed irrevocably. Those around him noticed the difference, the shift from aggressive dominance to careful, measured caution. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes. Stephen didn't seek validation. He didn't need to. The aftermath was unfolding naturally, without intervention. The respect he had earned was evident in the way people adjusted their behavior, in the way the enforcer's aura of intimidation had diminished, and in the quiet acknowledgement of the room's new balance. It was a controlled aftermath, a ripple effect from his calm presence, showing how composure and authority could quietly, effectively reshape the environment. As the night continued, conversations returned, laughter resumed, and the initial tension faded. Yet, the impact of the confrontation remained. People spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen, recounting details to friends who had missed it. Every recounting emphasized the same point. It wasn't about strength, size, or aggression. It was about control, calm, and the way Stephen had held himself throughout. Even the staff, who had witnessed many conflicts before, were visibly impressed. They discussed the encounter in quiet corners, acknowledging how rare it was to see dominance asserted without force. The club, once a scene of potential chaos, had returned to normal activity, but with a subtle, permanent shift in the atmosphere. Everyone present had learned, without a lecture or warning, about the power of presence and the impact of calm authority. Stephen finally moved toward a quiet corner, taking a moment to observe the room one last time. The enforcer had faded into the background, and the patrons were settling into their routines, but the memory of the confrontation lingered. It was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that something significant had occurred. In this aftermath, the club's energy had transformed, leaving a sense of order, respect, and the unmistakable understanding that calm, measured action could completely redefine the outcome of any situation. Stephen leaned back slightly, letting the noise of the club wash over him without pulling him in. He thought about how quickly tension could rise, and how easily it could spiral out of control, if someone let their emotions dictate their actions. That brief confrontation had shown him again that power wasn't about size or aggression. It was about control, timing, and awareness. Every decision in that moment had been deliberate, every gesture calculated without seeming calculated at all. He replayed the scene in his mind. The way the enforcer had tried to assert dominance, the way the crowd had reacted, the subtle shift in energy when he stayed calm. There was something almost fascinating about it, watching how a single person could influence an entire room without raising a hand. It made him think about human behavior, how people respond to confidence, and how easily fear or respect could be communicated without words. Even after the initial tension faded, he noticed how the aftermath had lingered. People weren't openly talking about it, but their actions spoke volumes. Staff were moving with a little more awareness. Patrons were adjusting their conversations, and the enforcer himself seemed smaller in both stature and presence. It was a reminder that consequences didn't always need to be loud or aggressive. They could be quiet, subtle, and just as impactful. Stephen considered how often people underestimated the value of composure. In many situations, he realized reactions were automatic, driven by ego, anger, or pride. But standing still, holding your ground without escalation, created a space where others had to reassess their own behavior. He thought about how that applied beyond this club, in every interaction where tension and conflict were possible. There was a clarity in reflection that was different from the adrenaline of confrontation. It allowed him to see the patterns, to notice what had worked and why. He could recognize the moments where small adjustments had made a huge difference, and he understood how even subtle expressions, like a calm tone, steady eyes, or a measured gesture, could completely shift the dynamics of a situation. Looking back, he also considered the enforcer's perspective. The attempt to intimidate had been genuine, but it had failed because it relied solely on brute force. Stephen realized that respect earned through composure was stronger than fear imposed through aggression. People might try to challenge it, but it couldn't be broken by mere physicality. That lesson, he knew, would stay with him far longer than the moment itself. He thought about the people in the room, those who had watched silently. Their reactions had been instructive too. Observing their body language, their whispered exchanges, and the way they adjusted their posture offered a clear view of how influence spreads. It wasn't loud or performative, it was subtle, quiet, and undeniable. As he sat there, reflecting on the night, Stephen understood that the encounter had been more than a test of strength. It had been a lesson in presence, awareness, and influence. The calm he had maintained had not just diffused a potentially volatile situation, it had reshaped the entire atmosphere. He thought about how much power there was in that, how often it was overlooked, and how important it was to practice that kind of control consistently. In the quiet moments of reflection, he felt a sense of satisfaction, not from dominance but from understanding. He had seen firsthand how restraint, confidence, and timing could achieve what force never could. And that realization, more than anything, left a lasting impression that would guide him in every interaction yet to come. Stephen stood at the edge of the room, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened settle around him. The music still played, the light still flickered, but there was a new energy in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that things had shifted. He noticed the subtle changes, the way people moved, the way conversations had softened, and even the way the enforcer avoided making eye contact. It wasn't about proving anything physically. It was about the balance that had been restored through calm presence and measured action. He let himself breathe for a moment, taking in the environment without letting it dictate his mood. That sense of control, of being centered even when chaos was nearby, was something he knew would stay with him. It wasn't about ego or victory, it was about clarity and the ability to navigate tense situations without losing sight of who he was. He realized how rare that clarity was, how often people allowed fear, pride, or frustration to make decisions for them, and how much easier life became when those impulses were kept in check. Stephen reflected on the subtle ways influence had spread through the room. People weren't just reacting to him, they were adjusting, recalibrating, and seeing the situation differently because he hadn't given them an obvious reason to fear or defy him. That kind of respect, earned silently, without aggression, was more lasting than any quick demonstration of force. It was quiet yet undeniable. He thought about the enforcer one last time and a small, almost imperceptible shift in perspective came over him. The man had tried to dominate, to impose his will, but the outcome had been completely different. That difference wasn't physical, it was in presence and timing, in the way Stephen had held himself. Every glance, every measured pause, every calm reaction had communicated strength far more effectively than intimidation ever could. As he adjusted his jacket and prepared to leave, Stephen noticed the lingering glances from the crowd. Some were curious, some cautious, but all had witnessed the same thing: control without chaos, confidence without aggression. He knew that for many of them, the memory of tonight would last longer than the music, or the lights, or any fleeting drama that had unfolded. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably powerful. He walked slowly toward the exit, feeling the difference in the room as he moved. The tension had dissipated, replaced by an unspoken understanding that some things couldn't be forced. Influence wasn't about strength or size. It was about presence, patience, and the ability to act at the right moment. That lesson, subtle yet profound, was something Stephen carried with him more heavily than any other. In those final moments, He allowed himself a quiet reflection on what had been achieved. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about demonstrating that composure and awareness could change outcomes in ways that brute force never could. Every step, every breath, every decision had contributed to a shift that was as much internal as it was external. As he reached the door, the sounds of the club fading behind him, Stephen felt a sense of completion. Not a triumphant victory, not a celebration, but a quiet certainty that he had navigated the situation with intention and control. That quiet certainty, steady and unshakable, was the final impression he left behind, and the one that would guide him long after the night ended.